Good afternoon. Warm welcome to the Butler Gallery in Kilkenny. My name is Alan Kerwin. I'm the Curator of Learning and Public Programming here at the Gallery, and delighted you can join us for this afternoon's talk, Creative Spaces for Irish LGBT artists, the role of museums and galleries. And for the topic of today's talk, we're joined by the Gallery's artist in residence, especially commissioned for Pride this year, Stephen Doyle. And Stephen's work very much looks at particularly LGBT themes and topics and the representation of the LGBT community's concerns. He focuses particularly on this in an activist way, deliberately so, which he will talk about more in his discussion. And for the Pride celebrations and for his work with the Butler Gallery, he's commissioned to produce a piece of work that looks at conversations that he's had with other people of colour and queer performers across our programme, and the feedback that they gave him of their feelings about what it's like to be in a public space as a queer person. Stephen is a graduate of Crawford College of Art and Design and has work represented in residencies around the world, particularly for the Zurich Prize at the National Gallery, where his work was the first to be exhibited in Ireland of a transgender person in Ireland. Stephen's in conversation with Una Mullally this afternoon from the Irish Times and also a contributor to The Guardian. Una is wider known as an author for her work In the Name of Love, which looked at the marriage equality referendum and also Repeal the Eighth, so really significant social issues in recent times for Ireland. So on that point, I will hand over to Una, and do feel free to leave comments and questions, which we'll get to you at the end of the conversation.
Thanks, Alan. Thrilled to be joined by Stephen Doyle here. We're going to get under the skin of LGBTQ plus representation in art, and also basically do a bit of a this is your life therapy session with regards to your artistic practice. So I hope you're ready for that. But I wanted to begin by asking you, what is your earliest memory of gravitating towards visual art as a child?
I think kind of my earliest memories are generally like playing with Lego. So like when I wouldn't have been the most academic or the most sporty person in the world, but I always kind of felt like creative spaces were kind of my own. So I'd always be coloring in coloring books or playing with Lego or something like that. So, and my parents, my mom especially, was very encouraging. So like anytime something artistic came up, she'd be like, "Gosh, you might as well, bring out the paints and the paper, and we'll see what happens." And I remember actually one of my earliest memories of kind of, I'm actually kind of good at this is there was a drawing competition at work for the kids of the staff. So they would paint their parents at work, and there was like prizes for different categories. And I remember at like 8, I ended up getting one of them. It was like an Easter egg or something like that, but it was just this kind of really small thing that like meant that like I was good at something and I was being rewarded for it, whereas up till that point I kind of didn't really see myself as the smarty person in class or the runner or the soccer player. So it was just this kind of finding my tribe kind of thing.
That's interesting that you were actually painting portraits that early on.
Well, portrait is a very kind word to describe it. It was literally like loops for arms and heads, but it was just this like I did my mom in the staff room with all her colleagues, but it was literally like aerial view and like rudimentary like kettles and donuts for like the security officer who was downstairs. It was madness, but it was just kind of cute, to be fair, looking back on it.
And then as like a teenager, what kind of stuff were you gravitating towards? What interests you as subject matter?
I mean, in secondary school, I think the art room was kind of the only safe space for me. I think it's very true of all kind of queer kids that like the art room, the English room, the music room, and the woodwork room are kind of the places that we gravitate towards, because it's something that allows us to express ourselves without it being overtly kind of obvious. I think, I remember being kind of gravitated towards a lot with music at the time, and kind of trying to visualize some lyrics of songs and stuff like that. And my junior cert was very much about like visualizing kind of the persona in lyrics and stuff like that. It was very confusing, and I can't even really, too embarrassing to even bring up the artist that I picked at the time.
You're obviously going to have to say who it is.
Okay, first of all, I think it was the Beatles, and that was kind of like, you know, the neutral scent of like, you know, no one could like really question the taste level there. Then it was Maroon 5.
Oh, that is actually pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, it was Songs About Jane, which I feel like is their only album that they did well. It went downhill from there. And then, I think it was the Scissor Sisters then for the last. That was my kind of like, the gay one. I was like, this is the one I'm kind of like, these guys are cool, but I can't really talk about how cool they are. So I can like mess around with paint and, you know, really kind of get into the kind of expression in their work, and kind of that's where I felt most comfortable.
It's interesting that that was framed like that for you at that stage, because kind of what you're describing is, I think, something that a lot of queer people really intuitively get, where you approach what you perceive to be neutral ground, and then you broaden the territories out until you find your own little patch that you can play on. For example, the canon of the Scissor Sisters. That's a really intriguing thing, isn't it? Like, how did you find that you had to negotiate or navigate your own territory within what would become a broader, you know, art territory?
Like, I mean, I think, you know, I wasn't able to kind of really discuss things the way I wanted them until maybe like the second year of college. Like I wasn't out until like a few days before the marriage referendum to everyone. So like I was never able to just really get into the real conversations of things. And I think until I was able to kind of really accept myself and put myself into that space as I truly am, then I was never really expressing myself properly. It was always kind of rudimentary things that didn't really make sense. And, you know, art college in first year was just experimentation of different things, and that's fine. But I think towards the end, you really have to start talking about what you know. And at the time, all I knew was finding my identity and my community and what that means and the history behind it. And I don't think it was until then that I really kind of got into it, you know.
What do you think that ambiguity or enforced kind of reluctance gave you in a positive way artistically? Sorry,
what do you mean by that now?
That if you're talking about finding your way, or not necessarily knowing how to be honest with yourself as an artist and expressing yourself, like that's quite an oppressive state.
Yeah.
But do you think that trying to navigate that messiness gave you something artistically?
Definitely. I think it gave me, my own language within visual art, as in I think that's very important for all visual artists, that you find what expresses yourself most authentically, rather than I want to draw like Keith Haring, or I want to paint like Bacon or Rigu or anything like that. That works for them because it comes from their experiences, but you have to figure out who you are first before you can find it. So it's very kind of catch-22 kind of scenario. So I think, you know, allowing myself to exist as I am really kind of gave me a much stronger aesthetic and ability to tackle the work than I would have if I was still kind of to myself and closeted and sectioned off. Because, I mean, what would that be? Like, what's an artist without a voice?
What artists, obviously you mentioned a couple of like you know, massive figures there. What artists did you, before you were, and obviously we're always finding our voice all the time, but before you really clicked into a mode, were there any particular artists that you were seeing some kind of representation that spoke to you in their work?
No, I mean, I remember like I loved exploring galleries as a kid. I mean, there was something about it that just kind of was kind of magical walking into those spaces. But I feel like for representation, you needed like a PhD in art history to really kind of decipher the symbolism within all the work, to kind of maybe find this kind of gray area of, you know, she was living with her friend for 25 years and this is the portrait of them together. And it was like, yeah, and then the work would never like state that they were a couple of 25 years or anything like, so it was never this kind of, this is what it is. It was always within this very kind of gray area. And I suppose that kind of message sinks in, you know, you learn that this is not something that is public discourse. This is something that you shouldn't talk about. And that's what kind of, when going into those spaces, kind of reinforces in you, which is a shame to have that as a young queer person, that it's tainted, even though you're finding this wonderful stuff and inspired by it. It's reinforcing that kind of societal dictation that you should, this is how life is and these are the structures in place. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a funny one, because even when the work is visible or presented to you or taught to you, but the person's identity is kept covert or not fully contextualized, it's such a loss. Like, I often remember thinking a few years ago, like, how different my teenage self would have been if I had known Elizabeth Bishop, the poet who we're being taught was gay. But it was just like, no, this is just, because people, I suppose, like, the heteronormative structures don't necessarily see how important that would be to you know, to find that kind of representation or like fellow traveler kind of vibe.
Yeah, I think you know, straight people are very lucky in that they never have to question that. They walk in and they know that there's a conversation that they can relate to in that space. And when we walk in there, it's kind of like, where are we? And if we are there, it's just lost somewhere. And I think that, you know, that's what I wanted to kind of do with my work, is that I really wanted to change that narrative, that like when you walk into the space and you see the work, you know immediately that it's for those people specifically. And you know, there's no, even in the visual aspects of it, it's odd or it's different or it's that otherness. But even when it's written in text, there's definitely the word queer in there about 60 times. You know that like it's for you specifically. And I think that's the only difference between the work that I make and like the Hennessy's and the Bacons in Irish art history, is that they were still discussing the same things. It was just, there's a huge difference in dialogue now. And, you know, I'm standing on the shoulders of people who have allowed me to publicly speak about it. So I think I kind of owe it to kind of continue along that path, that the next generation don't have to search in galleries anymore, that they can just walk in and feel like they belong in Ireland. And I think, you know.
How were you surprised as your like practice evolved? Was there any aspect of it that you were surprised by as it developed, that you thought like, oh, I didn't see it going in this particular way? Or
well, I was surprised by people actually liking it. If I'm being totally truthful.
That was a very nice surprise.
That was a very nice surprise, because, you know, I was, you know, coming out of college and I was like, oh, this is how we're treated by you lot. And I was surprised that people were like, yes, we want to have those conversations in our space. I'm like, what? And you know, people were wanting to put me in exhibitions with other artists, and there was just this open willingness that, people seem to be starved for this kind of conversation. So it was a lovely surprise to have, but I was just making something that I needed to make. It wasn't that I was kind of expecting anything of it, and that was a nice surprise. But I suppose on a practical way, the work kind of is continually progressing, and there's more kind of layers to things that I didn't expect. Like, it started out as documentation and kind of a historical kind of eye on it, but now it's kind of transitioning into kind of mental health. It's social, political kind of structures to it. There's a lot more to it than I thought, and I'm kind of delighted that there's more to discuss, but also not delighted that there's more to discuss.
Well, it's, yeah, that thing of like the more territory you explore, like there's like more. It's like the kind of the rolling out of creative practice, I suppose. When you talk about discovering your voice, discovering your visual language, what are the characteristics of that language and the themes of that voice? I know it's hard to talk about your own work in that way, but
like for me, I had some amazing drawing tutors who never kind of corrected anything that I did in that, it should be this way, it should be the other way. They kind of taught me to really consider what drawing even is to begin with. And I think that approach, like, there was never a day in college where there was, oh, this is how you apply paint to a canvas, and it was very much, here's paint on a canvas, do what you want with it and come back to me and talk to me about it. And I think that really helped me in that I wasn't trying to paint like anyone else, and because of it, I've been able to come up with some outside the box kind of approaches to painting. Like, I've used mirrors in an installation with spray paint on them. I've used metal rods overlapping pictures and paintings. I've used neon. I've used ceramics that join in with the work. I'm in an upcoming exhibition. I have rope coming from one side of one piece to another, and I think in that there's that kind of othering and that immediate kind of correlation to, that's not how painting should be, which is my way of kind of saying that the normal structure of inside the box kind of way we've been taught to look at work is not how I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it from a queer perspective. And that othering is not just this kind of nice thing in a frame. It can be, but it can also be this.
Yeah. That, multi-material, multimedia type use is also like follows along from, the queer school, accidental or otherwise, of collage and things like that as well. Is it kind of mad when you're actually might be doing things intuitively to then realize that your gestures, your modes of making are actually coming from a queer sensibility without you even imposing that on it?
I think it's fascinating that, like, I think anytime I show it to a queer person, there's an excitement about it. And anytime I've shown it to someone from the straight side of life, has kind of gone, it's nice painting, but there was no need to put that metal bar across it. Like, why are you doing that? And I was kind of, and I'm like, okay, then my work is doing what it should. It's causing you to react in a way that makes you feel slightly uncomfortable. And I kind of enjoy that secretly, that you're having this kind of, I don't know if I like it yet. And I think with queer people, it's like, yay, it's weird, I love it. And that's what I kind of want, I suppose. That way of challenging people. I think that's important to have in the work.
Yeah, messing with conventions that then other people are like, intuitively, I too, my existence messes with the convention, therefore this is my painting. What kind of bodies or personalities or figures are you drawn to that captivate you? Is there any through line, do you think?
Well, since my third year of college, I've only painted queer people. So I've never had a model come in just for the sake of having a model come in. They've always been someone from the community who have a story that hasn't been out there yet or within work. So whether it's discussing same-sex relationships, mental health, or gender identity, it's always kind of inspired by them, and I love having them come into the studio or meeting them for coffee and having a chat and talking about it and how they would like to be viewed, and then making the work around that conversation, because I'm a male presenting white gay. Like, I don't really feel like I have the authority to discuss trans identity or female same-sex relationships or anything like that, because I don't have first-hand experience. So I feel like that step needs to happen, because what happened, like, I mean, historically, if you look at like work like Tom of Finland, it's always this kind of like homoerotic, very masculine white guy in leather, and that is a part of queer life, but it's not all of it. And you just see these figures and you're like, there's more people out there that don't look like this than look like this. And it's important to kind of show that diversity within the community. And I think that's a major thing that's lacking within the visual arts, is that people only represent the people that have the same experiences as them or look like them. And I really want to kind of branch out and involve people more. And I really like the community aspect of that it feels like my work and theirs.
So it's a more collaborative thing.
I think so. That like I get inspired by like where like the ceramic came from with like I had a residency in Shanghai, and I met with Vogers, and we kind of sat down for lunch, and it was just this kind of typical kind of community-based eating setup where everyone shares, and there's this lovely kind of camaraderie to it, and that's very much a part of the Chinese identity, and it's a beautiful thing. And I just wanted to combine that with a sense of there was the history of their community isn't within this, so it was just this lovely kind of thing that wouldn't have happened if I stayed at home and just read to myself and used generic kind of people to sit for me. There would be a kind of almost falsehood to it. So by having those things, it causes this wonderful kind of spark that is kind of the key for successful work, in my opinion.
How important is travel to your work?
It's pretty important. I think even within Ireland, that I'm based in Cork City, so like not every single person who has an interesting story is based there, no matter how much we'd like to pretend. So I like traveling to like the Dublins, the Kilkennys, the Offaly's, and those kind of places to meet people who have a story to tell, and and it goes beyond that as well. I suppose I've been Russia, I've been to China and the UK. Not as glamorous, but still nice. But it's important to kind of branch out and kind of, because they will have even different stories on top of that. They have different political, social structures, and their lives will be very different to ours. So I think it's important to go there and experience things firsthand, because again, just by reading about them, you kind of miss out on stuff.
Have you found like similar community tropes in, let's say you're traveling in Russia, you're traveling in Shanghai, that you find quite identifiable as like a global queer community experience, or is that kind of collapsing it a little?
No, I think modern technology kind of has allowed a kind of global family to kind of exist, and And I find that anytime I travel to these different places, there's always common ground. You know, there's always an interest in drag, or there's an interest in going out with friends, or there's an interest with something that we have in common, or specific movies or music or whatever. And I think, you know, there are similarities in that everyone has that kind of double life kind of setup, and at some point they've experienced that fear of conjecture by others, or you know, having to split their work life with their social life, or their family life with their social life. And you know, I think that allows me to kind of sympathize or empathize, and that it kind of breaks down a lot of barriers very quickly. So we can kind of bond a bit closer, and I think that allows for conversation to kind of flow. I mean, I will admit that while in China, it was very helpful to have an interpreter. But other than that, I mean, there was a kind of closeness in that we had that kind of love of similar things. But I could correlate to the double life, and it doesn't always surprise me that people have to live like that, but it doesn't get easier to hear that, like, no matter where you go, people are still not dealing with that or having to deal with that.
Tell me about your work as the artist in residence here then. What have you been doing, and what have you been exploring, really?
So Alan, as you mentioned, kind of put me in contact with a number of different people who kind of shared their experiences of living in Ireland, and they kind of discussed race and gender identity, and I was kind of inspired by their stories that, you know, things that I would never even question were things that they had to deal with on a daily basis. And I thought it was an opportune time to do a kind of exercise in empathy, and kind of putting myself in other people's shoes for a number of weeks. And I decided to kind of explore kind of public spaces and sit down and start to draw them, and that normally kind of frees up my mind to kind of consider things a bit more, in that I imagine what it would be like walking into this space if I was a person of color, or if I was a trans woman, what that might be like, and if I would be stopped at a door, followed around, all those kinds of things that, you know, as a male presenting white person, I wouldn't get. And it just kind of made me that bit more kind of connected to the community. I think that, you know, I was acknowledging my privilege, and I think that that's something that not just the straight community has to do, but something that especially the kind of the G and the L, but specifically the G's, that that there is a lack of, once we get what we want, it kind of falls away for the rest. Like, I suppose there would be a very good example of that happening during the Stonewall riots, of like, as soon as gay people got recognition, the trans women were kind of cast aside, and they didn't really want to kind of assist them in their journey. And I think that that's something that really needs to change, in that we need to really help one another up. So once I kind of started getting into that mindset, it became this kind of, I was taking on all kind of angst and you know, feeling that bit of unsafe that I sometimes get if I'm holding my partner's hand in public, or, you know, walking home alone in something a bit more flamboyant. And I was kind of transferring that over to this to this piece, and I just feel like it's embodies that sensibility that I think we need to put ourselves in more.
How have things changed for you creatively over the last year and a half? Is there anything that has emerged that you're surprised by, or that is a new little thing that you want to explore?
Well, in the last year and a half, I haven't had access to my studio. And that it was the first time maybe in about 10 years that I wasn't able to create in the way that I wanted. And it was a bit like having my hands tied, and my partner and I live in separate households, so we couldn't meet up like we'd normally do. So that was quite another layer of difficulty. So it kind of was what I feel like and of course sectioned off from the community as well, in that there were no public spaces available, and it was hard to kind of get together and talk and, you know, have those kind of conversations that we usually love having. So you know, there was a lot of minuses in the last year and a half. So I think that the work, or all I wanted to do was make stuff, and I had projects in my head that I needed to get out but couldn't. So it kind of, you know, gave me a lot of stress that I hadn't had to deal with in a number of years. Usually it was go down to the studio, do a drawing, and come back and feel kind of a bit lighter, whereas I was holding it for a year and a half. And I think, you know, I was in the middle of I was in the middle of a project with Butler Gallery about my experiences during secondary school and as an adult, and I just kind of couldn't process it without visualizing it. I couldn't, even no matter how much I kind of spoke about it, there was no progress because I couldn't push it out of me essentially and onto a canvas. And I know that sounds very pretentious, but it was true in that, like, that's the way I've learned to deal with things, and that was kind of stripped away. So I think all I kind of need to do now that I'm able back and working is to continue processing those things. You know, I think that project in particular is a very personal one, in that I think as queer people we're kind of given a trauma in institutions like school, and then as adults we have to kind of pick it apart and carry it around with us, and you know, we don't really get to explore our identities fully until later in life, and that's kind of this thing that I need to kind of keep processing. So I'm kind of glad that I'm able to get back and kind of put what I value, what the pandemic has kind of shown me is what I value most, and how to kind of visualize that as best I can.
That sounds like a more overtly personal project than your previous work.
Yeah. Like,
why do you think that's coming out now?
I think it's just because I normally I want to kind of pull people up with me, whereas during the lockdown I was isolated and on my own, and I didn't really have a choice but to put me in the frame. And you know, there was no kind of, again, getting authentic subjects or getting authentic sitters was impossible too. So I couldn't like make up an image that wasn't real to me. So the only person I had access to was myself.
That's scary as well, creatively, is it?
Yeah, I generally, you know, I generally don't like putting myself in the work unless I absolutely have to. Just because it's again, it seems very kind of narcissistic almost, or somehow it kind of excludes people, I think, you know, if the artist is just talking about themselves. But I think, you know, with the upcoming work, I feel as though it's something a lot of people can relate to. So that kind of, in some way, doesn't make me feel as nervous about it, that it's not just about me. I feel like a lot of people would relate to it.
And finally, thank you so much for discussing your work so openly. It's fascinating. But I was wondering, like, maybe this is an unfair question to end on, but if somebody walks into a gallery and they see one of your pieces, what do you want them to get out of that? I mean, obviously everybody's experience standing in front of an artwork is individual, but what are the dream things that you would like people to be feeling or channeling?
Like, I suppose I'd like them to kind of be able to see themselves, even if it's not somebody who looks exactly like them, but that they've had their experiences are the same as this person, or, you know, relief that these conversations are being had in public spaces, and that museums and galleries are actually cherishing these conversations and including us more. You know, I think that has a lot of power in it, that, you know, it's not just this kind of temporary thing that, you know, it's maybe part of a collection that, like, it's on par with something that is iconically Irish. Like, Men of the South piece is 10 feet away from a piece that I have in the Crawford at the minute, and that is huge to me, because on a personal note, you know, it's my work in a collection, but also they're seeing a queer person as an Irish person, and those things are the same. You know, they're not sectioned off like we've been kind of ingrained to think, that Irish identity takes many forms. And I think that's kind of what I want people to kind of see the most, is that diversity is very much Irish.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen,
problem. Thanks
for your honesty and your insights. Alan?
Yes, just a few questions. The first one actually is about your work behind you.
Okay.
And kind of really for a description of what was your intention in creating this illustration?
My intention really was to kind of sum up the sensibility and the experiences of the people I spoke to, not so much the reality of visual depiction, so that you kind of go away from it with the same feelings that these people feel. And, you know, as long as I've done that, I think it's successful.
Another question is more about emerging artists. Is how can emerging artists get a break? What is it that artists need to do to get noticed, and what would be your advice?
If somebody could answer that for me, that would be great. I don't know myself. I think the most important thing is, if you love what you're doing, then it won't really seem like work. I mean, you kind of have to be ambitious, and if you really kind of want to do this, you have to put yourself into it 100%. Even though it will take time, you know, you have to kind of keep at it. It's essentially, you know, you're self-employing yourself. And even business professionals will tell you it takes about 2 years before you can even really start seeing yourself as an artist. So just keep at it.
And finally, is there, what do you think about the fact that you may be tagged in what you've talked about with Una, tagged as an LGBT artist rather than an artist who happens to be LGBT?
I mean, you know, what people label me as is kind of something that I'm used to, so I don't really mind one way or the other. I think that's up to them. I think that, you know, I'm an artist. I am LGBTQ+, so, you know, those things are very much a part of my work and my identity, so I think it would be accurate, but I mean, as long as you're calling me, it's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. And thanks again to everybody here, the team making the stream happen,
Yes,
and
thank you.
Stephen and to Alan and everyone at the Butler Gallery. And happy Pride once again.